Sound arrives before thought does. Before you have decided what to make of it, sound has already entered you, traveling as mechanical pressure waves through air, through bone, into the fluid-filled cochlea, where hair cells transduce vibration into electrochemical signal, and the signal climbs the auditory nerve to reach the cortex a fraction of a second before any conscious recognition has time to assemble itself. You do not choose to hear. You are simply heard through. This is not metaphor. It is anatomy. Music, then, is an act done to the human being before it can be chosen by one, which raises a question we have not spent nearly enough time sitting with. If sound precedes volition, what does it mean that human beings have been making music, deliberately, ritually, with clear aesthetic intention, for at least 60,000 years? The Divje Babe flute, fashioned from the femur of a cave bear, predates writing by 50 millennia. Before we had gods, governments, or granaries, we were imposing pattern on vibration. We were making music before we made almost anything else. The relationship between the human being and sound is not incidental. It is constitutive. We are born hearing. The auditory system is functional well before birth. The foetus responds to sound from roughly 18 weeks of gestation, long before vision or proprioception are of much use. The first thing a newborn can locate in space is a sound source. The heartbeat of the mother, 60 to 80 pulses per minute, is the earliest rhythmic environment any human being inhabits. Rhythm, then, is not something we learn. It is something we arrive already knowing. Music does not teach the body about time. The body already understands time. Music is what happens when that understanding is externalized, structured, and shared. What we have not fully reckoned with is how deep the biological roots of that externalization go, and what happens to a nervous system that is exposed to it. The architecture of listening. The brain, when it encounters music, does not process it the way it processes a sentence or a landscape, in a localized region running a sequential parse. Music is processed everywhere simultaneously, and the simultaneity is the point. The auditory cortex handles the raw spectral decomposition, pitch, timbre, the frequency relationships that make a chord feel resolved or suspended. The motor cortex activates in anticipation of rhythm, which is why you tap your foot before you decide to, and why a predictable beat suddenly going silent is more disorienting than an unpredictable sound. The cerebellum manages timing with the kind of precision that makes arriving one semiquaver late feel wrong before any conscious analysis says why. Broca's area, classically designated as the language production region, fires in response to harmonic syntax. Music has grammar, and the brain that processes spoken grammar is the same brain that processes musical grammar, in ways that overlap enough to be neither coincidence nor metaphor. The prefrontal cortex, the great predictor, builds running models of what the music will do next and registers their violation or confirmation with something functionally identical to surprise, which is another way of saying that the tension and resolution of a harmonic progression is experienced not as aesthetic event, but as epistemic one. The brain expects, and music either satisfies or defeats those expectations, and the quality of listening is in large part the quality of that exchange. And then there is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, the reward circuit that motivates eating, sex, and social bonding. Music reaches it. The experience researchers now term frisson, the chill, the involuntary shudder that moves through the body at a particularly affecting musical moment, is accompanied by measurable dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, verifiable by PET scan. Roughly 2/3 of the population experience it, the remainder do not, in a distribution that appears to have a genuine genetic component. The people who get chills from music are not being sentimental. They are receiving a biological reward from a stimulus that, strictly speaking, confers no reproductive or survival advantage that evolutionary biology has yet satisfactorily explained. We do not yet know why music activates the reward circuit. We know only that it does, reliably, across cultures and across the documented history of human civilization. Music is one of the few stimuli that produces coherent bilateral activation across the entire cerebral cortex. Playing an instrument, actually learning to play, not merely listening, is among the most neurologically complex behaviors we have documented in ordinary human life. It demands simultaneous integration of fine motor output, auditory feedback, visual reading, memory retrieval, emotional regulation, and anticipatory timing, often in social coordination with other players, all of it in real time. The brain that learns music is not the same brain that did not. The structural changes are measurable. Expanded auditory cortex surface area, thickened corpus callosum, reorganized motor cortex. The London taxi driver study demonstrated hippocampal growth from sustained navigational demand. Musician studies demonstrate analogous changes from sustained musical demand. The instrument teaches the brain. Not by making it generally smarter, that claim requires more precision, but by making it structurally different in ways that persist. What music does to the mind. The neuropsychological effects of music fall into two categories worth holding separately, the acute and the chronic. Acutely, music modulates the autonomic nervous system in ways that are well characterized and clinically deployed. Slow-tempo music at low intensity reduces cortisol, lowers heart rate, and shifts the nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance, the rest and digest state. Upbeat music at higher intensity activates the sympathetic system in ways that improve output on physical tasks. This is the reason hospital anesthesia departments now routinely use carefully selected music to reduce preoperative anxiety, and it is the reason sports facilities treat playlist curation as a recognized performance variable. The physiological response to music is not subjective preference dressed up in pseudoscience. It is reproducible under controlled conditions with measurable biomarkers. Music and pain interact in ways that remain only partially understood, but are practically applied with real effect. Patients reporting postoperative pain who listen to music consistently require lower doses of analgesic medication than controls. The hypothesis mechanism is attentional competition. Pain is not a passive signal transmitted from a site of damage, but an active construction of the brain's threat assessment architecture. Occupying cognitive bandwidth with music genuinely reduces the brain's capacity to amplify that construction. Music does not eliminate pain, it competes with it, and in controlled clinical settings, it wins often enough to be therapeutically meaningful. The chronic effects are more remarkable still. Autobiographical musical memories are encoded differently from other long-term memories, with stronger emotional tagging, bound more tightly to the limbic system, and demonstrably more resistant to the degradation that characterizes neurodegenerative disease. Patients in late-stage Alzheimer's disease, who can no longer recognize close family members or navigate familiar rooms, will frequently recognize songs from their youth with near-complete clarity. Singing words they cannot produce in conversation, responding with emotional precision to material they were believed to have lost. The music memory outlives the name memory. It outlives, in documented cases, nearly everything else. Neurologists running music therapy programs for dementia patients report not only emotional improvement, but brief but genuine windows of cognitive reconnection. Moments where someone who is otherwise gone is temporarily back. Melodic intonation therapy makes use of a related phenomenon. Stroke patients who lose spoken language through left hemisphere damage sometimes retain the ability to sing the same words. Because music is processed bilaterally, and the right hemisphere carries the melodic function that the damaged left hemisphere can no longer manage. The therapy uses that residual capacity, progressively, to rebuild spoken language. It has returned meaningful speech to patients who had been assessed as unlikely to recover it. It works because the brain's relationship to music is not decorative. It is structural, redundant in the engineering sense, preserved across damage in ways that suggest it was important enough to be worth protecting. The mind does not merely enjoy music. It relies on it, in ways that medicine is only now beginning to map with the seriousness the evidence warrants. The Mozart effect. In 1993, Rauscher, Shaw, and Kai, three researchers at the University of California, Irvine, published a paper in Nature reporting that college students who listened to Mozart's sonata for two pianos in D major, K448, for 10 minutes showed a temporary improvement on spatial reasoning tasks compared with students who sat in silence or listened to a relaxation tape. The effect lasted approximately 15 minutes. The paper was careful in its claims. It said nothing about children, said nothing about lasting benefit, recommended nothing to parents. What happened next is a lesson in the distance between a scientific finding and its public life. By the mid-1990s, the phrase Mozart effect had become a cultural object. Don Campbell's 1997 book of the same name claimed the effect extended to infants and lasted well beyond 10 minutes. The Baby Einstein product line launched on the premise that exposing infants to classical music would measurably boost their intellectual development. Florida passed legislation in 1998 requiring state-funded daycare centers to play classical music to children. Hospitals put Mozart in neonatal units. Parents purchased CDs in the hundreds of thousands, and the question of whether this was money well spent was not, at the time, asked with any urgency. The scientific literature was not cooperating. Attempts to replicate the original spatial reasoning improvement were inconsistent, and more controlled studies located the effect elsewhere than Mozart. The arousal and mood hypothesis emerged. Listening to any music you find pleasant produces a temporary improvement in performance on certain cognitive tasks because it elevates alertness and positive affect. One study tested this directly by replacing Mozart with a Stephen King audiobook read aloud. The Mozart group and the King group performed comparably on the spatial tasks. The effect was not Mozart. The effect was being in a better state than silence provides. The long-term cognitive benefit for infants from passive listening? No credible evidence was found. Disney eventually issued refunds for Baby Einstein DVDs following organized pressure from consumer groups whose core claim was that the educational assertions were unsubstantiated. The refunds were not contested. What the research does support, and this requires stating cleanly because it is substantively different from the popular claim, is that musical training produces genuine, lasting cognitive benefits. Children who learn to play instruments show measurable improvements in phonological awareness, language processing, executive function, and mathematical reasoning that are not attributable to socioeconomic confound. These effects are structural neurological changes resulting from sustained complex skill development over time. They are not the effect of listening to K448 in a waiting room. The Mozart effect was not a fabrication. It pointed at something real about the relationship between music, mood, and short-term cognitive performance. What it was not was evidence that passive listening produces lasting intelligence, and the distance between those two claims generated a minor industry and a widespread misconception that has not entirely dissipated. The lesson is not that music does nothing to cognition. It is that the mechanism matters, and the mechanism is engagement, not exposure. The note that changed everything. Before the 20th century, there was no standardized musical pitch. The note defined today as 440 Hz referred to a different frequency depending on which country you were in, which decade it was, which instrument maker had tuned your harpsichord, and which orchestra you were listening to. This is not widely known, and it matters more than it first appears. Across 4 centuries of European art music, from the late Renaissance through to the early Romantic period, the frequency assigned to the A above middle C varied by as much as 50 cycles per second. Handel's tuning fork, preserved to this day in Halle, gives an A of approximately 422.5 Hz. Baroque ensembles generally played with A falling between 415 Hz and 430 Hz. In certain regions and periods of the 18th century, 432 Hz was common enough to be treated as a working standard. The 19th century introduced what historians of music call pitch inflation. As concert venues expanded and orchestras competed for sonic brilliance, there was a collective drift upward. By the late 1800s, some orchestras had pushed the A to 452 Hz. The Vienna Philharmonic, at certain points, was playing at 456 Hz. The notes were the same on the page. The physical reality to which they referred had been quietly, incrementally redefined. 432 Hz is worth pausing on. When A is tuned to 432 Hz, the note C, in equal temperament, falls at approximately 256 Hz, which is 2 to the power of 8. Every C across every octave lands on a clean integer power of 2. The harmonic series resolves to frequencies with an internal mathematical symmetry that 440 Hz does not produce. Middle C at A equals 440 Hz is 261.63 Hz. Not a round number, not a clean exponent, not a particularly elegant figure. At 432 Hz, it is 256. This was observed by physicists and musicians before the standardization debates began, and it is the reason 432 Hz was sometimes called scientific pitch in the 19th century, not because of anything mystical, but because its mathematical properties were neater. In 1939, an international conference convened in London and agreed on A equals 440 Hz as the global standard for concert pitch. The decision was partly practical. The BBC needed to broadcast a reference tone and needed it to be consistent. And partly political, in the way that all international standardization is partly political. The International Organization for Standardization formalized it as ISO 16 in 1955. From that point forward, A was 440 Hz, everywhere, by definition. The consequences of this are more significant than they might appear. Every piece of music recorded since the mid-20th century, every studio album, every orchestral performance released on record, every digital sample library, every MIDI instrument, every tuner in every music shop on Earth is calibrated to a world in which A is 440 Hz. The harmonic content of every recorded note, its overtones, its relationship to the resonance frequencies of the rooms and instruments in which it was captured, the way its partials interact with the partials of every other note played simultaneously, is fixed to that standard. It cannot simply be undone by slowing a recording down, because the internal harmonic relationships do not shift in the way a uniform pitch change would suggest. The architecture of a chord in equal temperament is not the same architecture at a different root frequency. Music from before the standardization, the entire body of work produced by Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, was conceived for instruments tuned differently. When modern orchestras perform those works at A 440 Hz, the entire edifice is transposed upward by an amount that varies by composer, by era, by regional tradition. It is, technically, a different physical event than what was originally performed. It sounds like the same music because we have no working frame of reference for comparison, and because the human auditory system is skilled at recognizing relative relationships between notes, even as absolute frequencies shift. A single definitional decision made in 1939, a number, a committee, a letter of ratification, quietly restructured the harmonic reality of all music that followed. The vast majority of people alive today have never heard music at the frequencies for which the Western canon was originally conceived. Whether that matters, whether the difference is meaningful to the nervous system, to the emotional response, to the quality of the listening experience, is a question that has not yet received the serious scientific attention it merits. We have spent considerable effort studying how music changes the brain. We have not yet seriously asked whether the frequency of the note A changes what music does. That is perhaps a question worth asking next.